special guest today is Dr. Ofa Hafoka-Kanuch. Dr. Ofa has a PhD in counseling psychology and currently works as an assistant clinical professor for Brigham Young University's counseling and psychological services. She offers specialized help with multicultural and diversity issues, depression, anxiety disorders, and trauma. Dr. Ofa also runs a popular Instagram page at Dr. Ofa, is like the tag, with an aim to destigmatize mental health, help others break unhelpful cycles, and create a life of meaning and purpose. Today, Dr. Ofa's presentation is titled Coping with Race-Related Stress and Trauma in Your Relationship, where she will discuss and help you understand what race-related stress and trauma is, help you learn helpful ways to cope, and teach you how to support a partner who has experienced it as well. Dr. Ofa will hold an anonymous Q&A session for the final 15 minutes of this 1-hour webinar. Please feel free to write down your questions as they come up so you can remember them for the Q&A portion of this workshop. This workshop is also approved for 1 continuing education credit. You can email me at marriagecommission@usu.edu to request a certificate. And this webinar is also recorded, so you can go back and view it anytime afterwards, and you'll all be sent a link to the webinar, the recorded webinar, when tomorrow. Okay, I think that's everything. I want to give you as much time as possible, Dr. Ofa. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to have you here, and we're so excited to I just want to get started and give you as much time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that intro. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
It looks great.
Cool. Okay, welcome. I'm really excited to be here. Let's get started. I first want to, I have some acknowledgements that I want to give before we get started. I want to respect and recognize the indigenous land, the indigenous people who are the traditional and original stewards of the land that I'm on. In Utah, I'm on Shoshone, Goshu, and Ute tribe land. I also would like to show gratitude and appreciation and respect for them, and also for everyone that I come with. I always like to start my formal presentations with the quote from Maya Angelou: "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000." I know that I'm one, and I come with many ancestors, my community, a lot of people who stand by me and support me in this work of mental health, and also dealing and experiencing and dealing with the racial trauma. I want to honor African American foremothers and forefathers for helping to build this nation. I pay tribute to my own Pacific Islander ancestors, especially as it's May and it's still Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I also want to acknowledge and honor immigrants, old and new, from all around the world who have contributed to our rich society. Lastly, I want to acknowledge the Utah Marriage Commission for providing this platform as the space for us to talk and discuss racial trauma. Like Camilla mentioned, I will have a Q&A session at the very end. So if you hold your questions, I am happy to answer them, even if you submit them anonymously. Quick overview of what we'll be talking about. First, we'll define trauma and racial trauma. We'll talk about exploring the impacts of racial trauma on mental, psychological, and physical health. Then we'll move into coping with and healing from racial trauma, and then we'll end with how to support a loved one in a relationship who's dealt with racial trauma. My intentions and hope for this session is that you can listen and attend with your full self. I hope that as you're here listening, that you challenge yourself to think outside of your comfort zone, especially if you come from a place of privilege and power. When it comes to issues of race, we will all make mistakes. Even as a person of color, I still continue to make mistakes. I hope that as you're here participating and attending, that that you are willing to learn enough to lean into the discomfort of making mistakes and being vulnerable. That's where the growth happens. I also hope that this session, this webinar, translates into deeper, more enriched empathy in your relationships. So let's first start talking about trauma. It's really helpful for us to have a basic definition that's helpful for us to conceptualize racial trauma. So trauma, how I like to describe it is an experience that overwhelms your capacity to regulate your emotions. And this experience results in fragmentation and dissociation. Racial trauma is the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. People of color can be traumatized by different events that may include, some examples are racial profiling and police violence, workplace discrimination and harassment, community violence, distressing medical experiences, incarceration, and difficult immigration experiences. One thing to note about trauma is that trauma is the experience that someone has, not necessarily the event. Sometimes people who get into a car accident might not necessarily walk away from that feeling like it was traumatic, whereas others do. And so it's not necessarily the event, it's more the experience and how this event is impacting someone personally, collectively and personally. Many marginalized identities are having to navigate both racial trauma in the face of collective or other trauma that they're experiencing in their lives. This compounds their experience with racial trauma. Examples are race along with socioeconomic status, race and gender, race and education or access to healthcare, race and the pandemic that we've been living in. Not only is there the traumatic experience, but when you couple that with racial trauma, there's an intersection that leads to compound trauma that people of color will usually experience. We won't spend a lot of time talking about the intersecting and multiple identities, but I just wanted to point that out, that usually when people of color are experiencing racial trauma, it's compounded with other experiences of trauma that they are also experiencing in their lives. Also, one thing to note about racial trauma is that the prevalence of trauma exposure is higher among Black, Indigenous people of color or BIPOC compared to white, especially in the US, but also specifically studies have shown that African American and Latinx populations actually report the highest exposure of racial trauma. There are a couple of layers of racial trauma, like types of racial trauma that BIPOC will experience. First is historical, meaning like what happened to your people? How did you arrive here, like in the United States? There's also systemic. Most systems have a foundation of white supremacy. It's also important and critical that we look at the systemic and institutional ways that uphold racial trauma, uphold white supremacy that then perpetuate racial trauma. There's also intergenerational trauma, meaning the source of trauma, anxiety, stress may have happened or occurred generations ago that was then passed on. I know that with the Utah Marriage Commission, they had a presentation specifically on generational trauma a couple of weeks ago. Then there's direct and personal experiences that happen daily with that could lead to racial trauma. I'll get to that in a second. And then there's vicarious trauma, meaning that if a person of color is observing something happening to someone else that they could in their community that they could identify with, that could also affect them. So there's vicarious trauma. That one example is when we see in the media, when we see traumatic events happening, mass shootings happening, that could greatly affect BIPOC communities when they're experiencing vicarious trauma. One example of how racial or how BIPOC people are impacted by racial trauma is through ongoing microaggressions. When it comes to racial trauma, the difficulty about racial trauma is it's ongoing and it happens throughout the entire lifespan of BIPOC community, BIPOC individuals. Microaggressions are commonplace verbal or behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. There are 3 ways that we can break down microaggressions, and I'll go through examples and definitions of the 3 ways. First is microassault. This is the conscious, deliberate, explicit racial attacks. This is what typically occurs when someone thinks of racism. They are both verbal and nonverbal, and they're meant to hurt the victim. An example of racial or micro assaults are name calling or using racial slurs. The second type of microaggression is micro insult. And this is usually more unconscious, more subtle. It demeans and belittles the victim through racial slights or comments that seem innocuous. It seems like even though that they might be coming from a place that's well-intentioned, it's still insulting to a person of color. Some examples of this are BIPOC consistently being mistaken for the service worker when they're in a professional setting, when they're not. Another example is a woman clutching her purse when a person of color walks by. Another example is that I hear often is when people make comments that someone was admitted to higher education based off of affirmative action. These are examples of micro insults. And then the last form of microaggression is micro invalidation. This is comments and behaviors that exclude and invalidate their thoughts, feelings, or experiences in their life. This is also known as gaslighting. And so when people say statements like, I don't see color, or we're all of the human race, these are examples of micro invalidation. I really appreciate this quote. It comes from Peggy McIntosh in the book White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, or article. She said, I was taught to recognize racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought privilege and racial dominance on my group from birth. The face of racism is evolving from more overt hatred to ambiguous covert forms that's more difficult to identify, address, and heal from, especially when individuals who are BIPOC also have a hard time acknowledging and identifying racism when they're more covert. So I just want to move on to the impacts of racial trauma on our bodies. There are many ways that our bodies, our physical bodies, hold on to trauma, to anxiety, to stress. Usually we feel it physically before we can put words to it and make sense of it, especially if it's connected to mental health. So some of the ways are physical pain, stomach pain, headaches, cardiovascular disease, an increase in cardiovascular disease, hypertension, sorry, I'm trying to move. So hypertension, which is spikes in the blood pressure following exposure of a racist event. And then also studies show that after that spike, the blood pressure remains elevated after. Another example of racial trauma impact on physical health is a higher allostatic load, which is actually the wear and tear of the body caused by chronic stress. When the body is in a state of distress, we know that our body jumps into the stress response, which is pretty innate. It's automatic, which is the fight, flight, freeze response. When we, as people of color, experience racial trauma, our body stays in that elevated state. So it's harder to calm down. It's harder to relax when your body is elevated in that way. And then lastly, there's digestive issues as well. And then there's the impact of racial trauma on mental health. This is harder for people of color to identify when there are a lot of things going on in your lives. And so some of these negative impacts are the inability to concentrate, hyperactivity, or hypervigilance. You're always on alert, always looking for what's next, intrusive or anxious thoughts, having flashbacks or nightmares, restrictive emotional expression, especially if you come from a culture or a community that didn't normalize or validate your emotional expression. A lot of people of color, they try to avoid emotions. Then there's higher anxiety, higher depression, low self-esteem, which is also connected to internalized racism. Internalized racism is when people of color will behave in ways that uphold whiteness or white supremacy. When people of color are exposed to messages that they are not good enough or that they cannot succeed, they start to believe those messages, and they have a harder time calling out racism or identifying racism. Before we move on, I just want to take a minute just to pause. I want you, if you're listening, I just want you to check in with your body. I want you to pay attention to what is your body feeling right now in this moment. Are you feeling relaxed? Are you feeling tense? Are you anxious? Just tune into if there's tension in your body, where are you holding that tension? And then I just want to do a couple of breathing exercises before we move on to coping and healing. I want you to inhale for 4 seconds. I'll count. So inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 7, and then exhale for 8. So I'll tell you when to go. Ready, go. Inhale, hold, and then exhale for 8 seconds. I want to do that one more time. Inhale for 4, hold, and then exhale. I want to do another quick breathing exercise. It's also known as like the box. So it's going to be even all the way. Inhale for 4, holds for 4, exhale for 4, and then holds for 4. So if you can just imagine a box or run your eyes along the screen. I can count that out. So inhale, hold, exhale, and then hold. So grounding techniques can be really helpful in the moment if you're experiencing racism, if you're experiencing anything that could be triggering or activating for you. Grounding just helps you to anchor. Grounding helps you so that you don't spiral. It also helps you to be present in your body. So I find grounding techniques to be really helpful at first, just for you to slow down as we talk about difficult things. I want to move into coping and healing. There's a difference that I like to make between coping and healing. I like to think of coping as surviving. And when you are faced with trauma, stress, anxiety, it's really important for you to have some sense of like control so that you could, in your body, so that you could survive. This is really important. So when I think of coping, I think of what can I do right now for myself, right now to survive. When I think about healing, on the other hand, I think of what can I do so that I could thrive long term. Healing is more long term, and oftentimes healing is what can I do to repair, recover, mend, strengthen myself, my community, my family, and my generation. So healing is a little bit more long term. And so there's a difference, and I want to start off with coping, and then we'll get into what we can do to heal. So coping on the individual level, I think it's really important to start off with a quick mental health check-in, kind of just what we did with the grounding. Checking in with how am I feeling? Where is the tension in my body? What emotions am I feeling in my body? What am I holding on to? What do I need right now? And if it's I need a break, I need to disconnect, I need to slow down, regulate my breathing, regulate my emotions. That could be really helpful when you're doing a mental health check-in. It's important to set limits for yourself. Sometimes this is setting limits with exposure to the media, or setting time limits when you're watching the news. So sometimes setting limits for yourself is also a really good way to cope on the individual level. And then also engaging in mindfulness practices. When I say this, I mean grounding. How can I be present? What can I think about? Or what can I focus on? Even just focusing my gaze on when I'm right here, right now. It's important to be intentional about how you spend your energy. As people of color, as we're dealing and coping with racial trauma, this work is pretty exhausting. And so being able to say no to some things, especially the things that you feel pressure to do, so that you could fully show up when you say yes, that helps you to be more intentional with how you're spending your time and your energy. Sometimes we expect ourselves to do everything all at once, or to be 100 and to be perfect at everything that we're doing. And so it's helpful to understand that we're human, and to normalize slowing down, resting, and taking a break. And then pursuing activities that bring you joy. And this might change throughout your lifetime. And so always having like 2 or 3 things that you know that could bring you joy. Things that you can do on your own, and then things that you can do with your partner or with other people. And I'll get into that in a second. There's an article that I really appreciate. It's on radical healing, and it presents a framework for healing from racial trauma. And I'll go through, there are 5 main components of radical healing. The first is first thing for me to acknowledge is that radical healing includes acknowledgement of an active resistance from oppression. So acknowledging that it exists and that it's there, it's real, and also having a vision for possibilities of for freedom and for wellness. And this is physical wellness and mental health wellness. The first component is critical consciousness, and this includes critical reflection, deeply questioning how and why power relations are structured and maintained. So it includes reflection and also like critical action, knowing that you can take action to reduce oppression, even if it's just on a personal level. And then there's radical hope, believing that when you're fighting for something or when you're advocating for something, that it will not be in vain, it will not be futile, that change can happen. And then there's strength and resistance. So living joy-filled lives despite critical awareness of racial trauma and oppression. Living authentically and living a joy-filled life is a form of resistance. It's a form of reclaiming your joy, reclaiming your life. And so I like to think of being authentic and being happy, pursuing joy is actually a form of resistance against white supremacy or against racism. I really like this next component, and it's the cultural authenticity and self-knowledge. It's important as people of color, as you're healing from racial trauma, to do some research and explore what were the ancestral healing practices in your own family. This also might include like storytelling. It might include something artistic. It might include poetry or singing and dancing. And so first exploring what the ancestral healing is in your own family, and then trying to engage in that and whatever that might look like for you today. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And in that book, it talks about how trauma, the stories or the experiences of trauma live in the left brain. And for us to cope with it, for us to heal from it, we have to activate the right side of the brain, which is more of the artistic side of the brain. And then so I like to think of cultural authenticity as connecting with artistic healing practices that your ancestors have probably done, without even understanding that it could actually be a way to heal. Indigenous practices and Indigenous communities also are really deep in their spirituality practices too. And so I think whatever that looks like for you, being able to connect with not only just the higher power, but connecting with the land, connecting with other people, with family members, that could also be a really good practice towards healing. For many BIPOC communities, spiritual practices can be a source of comfort and healing, and spirituality in the form of like mindfulness and connection. And then lastly, there's collectivism. So seeking and cultivating support within community, and not just your cultural community, but just with other people who can agree with you, who can validate you and offer support. And then a couple of things about healing from racial trauma that I also want to note. Emotions provide information. So even whatever emotion it is that you're feeling, especially when you're experiencing microaggression or experiencing racism, the emotions that you have, even if it's anger, rage, you're disappointed, you're frustrated, you're exhausted, all of those things give you information. And so it's important for you to validate that yourself, that whatever emotion it is that you're feeling, it's okay to feel that way. And the the more you allow yourself and give yourself permission to feel it, the more effectively you can work through it. And then give yourself permission to rest. It's really exhausting to be the target of racism, to be the target of microaggressions. So um, it's so it's helpful if you gauge your energy levels and also schedule in time to rest and disconnect from the world so that you could recharge your body. And also seek support and seek mental health therapy. I am a psychologist, so I know the importance and how helpful therapy can be. I think it's also worth noting that as you or if you are experiencing racial trauma, find a therapist that has some training and some understanding on multicultural competence, so that they could provide you the support that you need when you are healing from racial trauma. And then I want to move on to offering support to a loved one or to a partner. There are a couple of things that I want to cover, so I will try. If you have questions, save your questions, and I will get to it at the very end. So how to support a loved one? This is specifically if you are in a place of privilege or you are in a place of power. First, raise awareness, seek your own education, raise awareness of your own biases, blind spots, and assumptions. We all have biases. We all have blind spots. It's not the BIPOC community's responsibility to educate you. If you really care and you're willing to learn, you will seek your own education around microaggressions, learn the historical and systemic individual racism, learn ways that you might be perpetuating racism as well. Then empathize, validate, and listen. Listen is really, really important. When someone tells you that you've said something that may have offended them, it's important to listen. It's important to practice one of the breathing techniques that we went over so that you can slow down your reaction and listen. It's also here that you have to keep your ego and your defensiveness in check. And I'll get to that in a second. Most people don't know how to show up, and it's okay if you don't know. It's okay for you to say, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, but I'm here and I value you as a person and I'm here to listen. And then advocate. It's important if you are in a position of privilege and power, you have to know that you can advocate in ways that many BIPOC individuals can't for themselves. There's a difference between being anti-racist and not being racist. And in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi goes through, explains this really well. But just to summarize, being not racist is very passive. It's also very defensive. When someone says, oh, no, I'm not racist, they're being very defensive. Whereas being anti-racist is taking action. It's doing something against racism. It's speaking up when your partner can't speak up for themselves. And so take action and be anti-racist. And then it's helpful to reach out too. So when something is happening, even on the national, the world level, reach out. So I reach out to your partner when you know that there's something in the news or even something individual to them that may have been hurtful. It's also probably helpful that you don't wait for them to ask you, that you probably say, hey, I know that this may have triggered you in some way, or I heard someone say this to you, so how can I be here for you? What kind of support can I offer? And then lastly, on this page, resist the urge to make it about you. That's when defensiveness will come up. If you are over explaining or making it about you. I think sometimes in the common responses that I hear is people will try to share an experience that in a way to relate, but it actually ends up making it about them. So resist that urge to make it about you. Again, when it comes to issues of race, we will all make mistakes. I want to go through some things of what not to say, and then we'll talk about a more helpful approach. So just very specifically, what things not to do. So invalidation and minimization, sometimes that sounds like someone saying, this happens to everyone, don't let this ruin your day, or you're tough, I know you'll get through this. Then there's denial. Do you really think it was about race? I'm sure they were stressed, or you just so happened to be there. I don't think they really meant to target you. I don't think it was about race. That's denial. And then there's defensiveness, or highlighting the other person's good intentions. I'm sorry that you feel that way. I don't think that was their intention. I don't think they mean it that way. You don't have to take it that way. That's defensiveness. And then oftentimes people will rush to problem solve. I know it's really uncomfortable to see our loved one, to see partners in pain, and so it makes sense, and it's natural, it's normal to rush to problem solving. But sometimes, or oftentimes, when we do that too quickly, it's unhelpful. It's also likely that, like, the person who's hurting doesn't want to problem solve, not yet. So rushing to problem solve and saying, you can always talk to your boss, or you can always talk to this person. It might not be the time to problem solve. And then there's dismissiveness. So it's just saying, oh, it's fine. They're just, that person was old, they don't get it. Sometimes those attitudes are generational. So that feels very dismissive. These are things not to say. And it's okay if you've made a mistake and you've said one of these things. This is where we learn and we grow. So what to do instead? First, take a mindful pause. Slow down your breathing, tune into your body. What am I feeling? What just happened? And then acknowledge and validate. I know you're upset. You have a reason to be upset. I'm so sorry that you're going through this. Also, this is a hard issue to bring up. I appreciate you trusting me with your anger and with your sadness. For many people of color, it's hard to talk about this, and which makes sense, right? It is hard. It's hard. It's exhausting. It's so even acknowledging that it's hard can be validating. And then asking questions from a place of compassion and curiosity. So, like, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about this? Or if you're up to it right now, can you tell me a little bit more about what happened? If not, can we talk about it later when you have the energy? So being compassionate and also being curious while keeping your own defensiveness in check. And then also offer support, right? I'm here to support you. I'm here, I stand by you. We can explore how to respond together. And then always show your desire to help. I won't tell anyone that you confided in me, but I'm here to help you look for resources. I'm here to find the next steps together. So, like I said, we all make mistakes. And I want to talk quickly about how to repair a relationship when you've committed a microaggression. Number one, use this as an opportunity to learn and strengthen your relationship. Conflict itself is not bad. Conflict can actually help to strengthen relationships, especially when you can navigate and effectively repair the conflict. This could actually strengthen your relationship. And so use this as an opportunity to learn. Number two, keep your ego and defensiveness in check. You don't have to make up excuses. You don't have to over explain for what you said or what you did. You don't have to say that you had good intentions or you meant no harm. Intentions don't matter as much as the impact that whatever happened had on the other person. So you also don't have to prove that you're a good person by providing evidence of your goodness or engaging in acts of kindness. I think just owning what you did and saying, I recognize that what I did was wrong and I'm sorry. So taking it seriously and agreeing that there's a problem to be fixed. Also, when it comes to listening, allowing the other person time to speak, without interrupting, and without jumping to over explaining. It's important to apologize, even if you're not completely sure about what you did was wrong. Acknowledge the impact and apologize. Also saying like, I'm sorry that I said something hurtful and insensitive. I want you to feel safe around me. And I want to learn more about what I can do to change and to be better. And then validate their pain, acknowledge your biases and blind spots, and then ask, is there anything else I can do to make this better for you? We all have biases. We all have blind spots. Some of these are unconscious, and so most times it's not until someone else points it out to us that that's made aware. And so use this as an opportunity for you to learn what your biases and what your blind spots are. And then lastly, as I go through these books, you can submit your questions if you have any. But these are some books, some recommended books, a place to start. This is not all. This is just for you to have some resources and books moving forward. So when it comes to race, here are a couple of books that are recommended. So you want to talk about race, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Race Matters, Me and White Supremacy. When it comes to generational trauma, I really like It Didn't Start With You or My Grandmother's Hands. And then if you're wanting to learn more about trauma, The Body Keeps the Score is an awesome book. Okay, let's open up for questions. If you have questions, you can submit it in the Q&A. There's also an option to submit questions anonymously. Camila, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
No, you're totally good. Yeah, I'll just reiterate, if you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A box. I see that there's a question in the chat. That's great. We'll start there. But if anyone has any other questions, if you click, there's like on the bar, you'll see a Q&A box you can ask questions in. But if I just see a question in the chat, if you open that up, you'll see one.
Oh, okay.
Popped up.
Awesome. Okay, so the question is, I'm white, but my baby is half Tongan. How can I prepare her? So preparation happens at home. And if you can have difficult conversations about race and acknowledging race and acknowledging differences, that will better prepare your baby to grow up acknowledging that differences are okay. So I think acknowledging that first at home, and also making space for, like, when you or when your children are experiencing have experiences of racism at school, they can come home and they can talk about it. You will be there to process and help them, and you'll also seek professional help when you need to. So I think being a safe person for your child to come home and process this without jumping to conclusions, without the defensiveness, but just allowing them to talk about what their experiences are with a lot of validation can be helpful as they're growing up, so that they know that this is a difficult, heavy topic, but their parent is willing to support, especially if you're white and you come from like a place of power and privilege as well. I think also going along with that is it would be helpful for you to advocate when you know that something is wrong or when you feel like your child is being discriminated against. I think you having a voice and being able to give your child a voice could be really helpful. I hope I answered that question. Let me know, Rachel, if you have any follow-up questions to that. Thank you, Christine. Christine said they've been having so many rough experiences. Experiences with racial trauma are hard. It's exhausting, and I think it's important to find support, to find community support from people who understand as well. Thanks, Christine. Any other books? I could offer some other recommendations. Rachel, if you just send me an email or on Instagram, just a message, I can look for more resources on top of the books that I talked about. So is there correct response when you are in areas of Utah where it seems and is communicated that young children have never seen African Americans? I think this is where education is really important. Even if you're in a rural city or a rural town, it's important to have move into areas where the stare or even attempt to touch it. Yeah, so it's important to diversify, right? Like if you are, and I've experienced this too, especially as when I first moved to Utah. I moved here 11 years ago, and I've experienced times when I remember coming here when people would ask if I'm from Hawaii originally, and people would ask if we took canoes to school. Like, no joke, people would ask if we took a canoe to school. And I feel like it's exhausting to have to answer questions, especially where people are ignorant about issues of race. But I think I think educating, also it's important to diversify, right? Like when you, even if you live in a place where it's not diverse, multiculturally diverse, that you are watching shows or even in the media, right? You're watching other things where you can expose yourself and your children to people of color. So the question was, is there a correct response? I think being able to speak up when you're the target of a microaggression, micro insult, I think speaking up is the correct response. Okay, a couple more questions. What do you suggest if I have a white mom who sometimes makes uncomfortable comments regarding race? I know she loves me. She doesn't understand that they're hurtful. I think it's difficult to have these conversations within your own family. It's also really vital that this happens in your own family. And so I think bringing it to her attention that her comments regarding race are examples of microaggressions. And if you go back to the three different ways, even if she loves you, even if it's coming from a place of like good intentions, it's still hurtful. So I think it's important that you say, hey, I know you love me, and what you've said about race has been hurtful for me in the past. Are you willing to learn? Are you willing to learn ways to validate me, or ways for me to feel comfortable talking to you? If not, then I have to set that boundary. If not, then I can't talk to you about race. If you are not a safe person for me, then I can't talk to you. And so I think having the conversation first about, like, one, help her to identify that what she's saying is hurtful. And then also saying, are you willing to learn? If you have the energy, or giving her resources to learn, so that you don't have to use your energy educating her. So giving her resources, and then saying, if this continues to happen, then I can't trust you. I can't go to you when I have issues regarding race. Okay, so someone said, I often feel triggered. What are some ways that I can feel a bit safer in those environments? So when our bodies are experiencing trauma or anxiety, our bodies will often feel like it's unsafe. And so it's important then to ground yourself. This is what's going to help you stop from spiraling, especially because you said, I always feel on edge and I expect something to happen even when it doesn't. That's probably spiraling, and you're probably having a traumatic response. So first, managing your physical response, slowing down your breathing, also paying attention to your environment. Where am I? Who am I with? What am I doing? What day is it today? What time of day is it right now? So orienting yourself to where you are and what you're doing. And also, if you are actually safe, then it's probably helpful that you remind yourself, I'm safe here in this environment. There's nothing dangerous or threatening to me in this environment. That'll help your body to slow down. It'll also help the anxious thoughts to slow down too. So breathing is, I think, always like number one. Just slow down your breathing. It's something that you can do by yourself. And then look for cues in the environment that can tell you that you're actually safe when you are safe. I also want to say that it makes sense when people of color are hypervigilant, or they're scared, they're living in fear, because oftentimes we are not safe, right? And so I don't want to dismiss that. But if you know where you are and you're in a familiar place, then it's helpful for you to remind yourself that you are safe when you actually are. Any other questions? Okay, what is a good way to shut down racial comments in a workspace without feeling uncomfortable when a person is defensive? Bringing it to their attention is helpful. Saying that is not okay. And sometimes, even if you, especially if you have the energy to, being able to say, this is hurtful because of this. And I think just keeping that very brief and getting straight to the point. I think also being very factual, without you confiding in them about like what it is that you're feeling. People have to earn the right to know what you're feeling, what your emotions are. So bringing it up to their attention, shutting down racial comments in a workplace. So I think it's hard to do this without feeling uncomfortable. So be okay with doing uncomfortable things. Anytime we talk about race, it is uncomfortable and it's heavy. And so I think normalizing that, being okay with that, and then leaning into that discomfort a little bit more. If someone else is defensive, also look at, are they in a place are they even willing to learn more? Or is this going to use up most of my energy and make me more frustrated? And so I think that's kind of where I can try to like do a quick assessment. Do I have a close enough relationship with this person that it's worth me doing the emotional labor to change something if they're defensive? And if not, especially if you're in a workplace, that's when you could go to a supervisor, you can go to the human resources for support and for help, or to other coworkers too, so that you're getting support that you need. Okay, someone asked, I'm Samoan, my stepdad is Tongan. My parents only include Tongan culture in our home, and there is tension when I bring up my own culture. What can I do to celebrate my own culture but not create contention? Okay, I am very familiar sometimes with the tension between these two cultures. It's important for you to give yourself permission to celebrate your identity, right? And so I think for you, as you're someone, I think being able to connect with your ancestry, connect with your culture, especially because there are some similarities, there are still some differences. And I think for you to reclaim that in your home also means you being able to connect with like what I talked about, like the ancestral healing, or even like family history work, and not just knowing who your ancestors are, but knowing their stories, knowing their lives, connecting with other family members on that side of your family too. Like your Samoan extended family could also be a way that you celebrate your culture without creating contention. Also, if there is contention, it sounds like that's more of like your stepdad's thing, right? That when there's contention, if he feels really defensive, that's not even yours to take care of, and it's not yours to have to work through. So I think it's okay for you to celebrate your own and have your stepdad manage his own emotions as they come up. Okay, anything else? Good questions. Okay, I think that wraps up our webinar. Last thing, please take the satisfaction survey. We really value and appreciate your feedback. So if you can take that, you'll get an email link after this.
Yes, thank you so much. It'll actually just pop up on your screen right when you log off. And it would be great to get your feedback on your experience of this webinar, what you learned. We'd love to hear what your experience was like. And thank you so much, Dr. Ofa, for this incredibly educational, informational webinar. And we really appreciate everybody's participation and questions. We really appreciate everyone's vulnerability with their questions. And yeah, thank you so much. This was just wonderful. And we'd love to have you back another time, Dr. Ofa.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thank you everyone for coming.
Awesome. Thank you. See you guys.